"You've been living off this family long enough, Margaret," my daughter-in-law whispered behind me at her bridal shower, just seconds before I realized someone had stuck a sticker on my back that said leech in bright pink letters. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just smiled softly and folded the sticker into my purse while the women around the table pretended not to stare. "I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." The bridal shower was held at the Fairfield Country Club in Connecticut, the kind of place with crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and waiters who never stopped smiling even when they overheard uncomfortable conversations. Claire had chosen pale ivory roses for the centerpieces and expensive gold-trimmed place cards for every guest. Everything looked elegant, perfect, controlled. That was Claire's specialty. She liked everything polished enough to hide what was underneath. I arrived 15 minutes early carrying a carefully wrapped box with satin ribbon tied around it. Inside was my late husband Richard's mother's diamond bracelet, a family heirloom passed down through 4 generations of Whitmore women. Richard had once told me he wanted Claire to have it someday. At the time, I believed she would treasure it. The hostess greeted me with a rehearsed smile and pointed me toward the private ballroom upstairs. "They're all waiting for you," she said. I remember thinking that sounded warm, inviting. I should have known better. The room quieted slightly when I entered. Not completely, just enough for me to notice. Claire stood near the mimosa station in a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my first car. She smiled when she saw me, but it never quite reached her eyes. "Margaret," she said sweetly, air-kissing beside my cheek. "You made it." "Of course I did," I replied. "I wouldn't miss this." Ethan stood beside her adjusting his tie even though this was supposed to be a women-only brunch. He barely looked at me. "Hey, Mom," he muttered before checking his phone again. That small gesture hurt more than I expected. My son used to light up whenever he saw me walk into a room. After Richard died 2 years ago, something changed in him. Or maybe Claire simply became louder than the part of him that once loved me openly. I took my seat near the end of the long table while the women resumed chatting about wedding venues, honeymoon resorts, and floral arrangements. I noticed quickly that no one really included me in the conversations. Every time I tried speaking, someone interrupted politely and redirected attention back to Claire. It was subtle enough that an outsider might not notice. But women my age notice everything, especially silence. A server refilled my coffee while Claire opened gifts dramatically at the front of the room. Laughter echoed against the tall ceilings. Champagne glasses clinked. Someone began taking photos for social media. I remember smoothing the wrinkles from my navy dress and wishing Richard were sitting beside me. He would have squeezed my hand under the table and whispered something sarcastic that would make me laugh. He always knew when I felt uncomfortable before I even spoke. About an hour into the shower, I excused myself to the restroom. As I crossed the ballroom, I noticed 2 younger women near the dessert table staring at me strangely before quickly looking away. One of them covered her mouth to stop herself from laughing. I thought maybe there was lipstick on my teeth or a stain on my dress. Inside the restroom, I checked my reflection carefully. My silver hair was still pinned neatly. My pearl earrings matched my necklace perfectly. Then I turned slightly toward the mirror and saw it. Bright pink, stuck directly between my shoulder blades. Leech. For a moment, I simply stared at my own reflection. The word looked absurd against the elegant navy fabric. Cheap, cruel, childish. My fingers moved slowly as I peeled the sticker away from my dress. I noticed someone had pressed it down firmly so it wouldn't fall off easily. That meant this wasn't random. Someone wanted it seen. I stood there quietly for several seconds holding the sticker in my hand while laughter drifted faintly through the ballroom doors outside. Then I folded the sticker once, twice, slipped it into my purse, touched up my lipstick, and walked back into the party smiling. Because at 68 years old, I had already learned something dangerous about humiliation. The people trying hardest to embarrass you are usually terrified of what happens when you finally stop pretending not to see them clearly. I drove home from the country club with the radio turned off and both hands wrapped tightly around the steering wheel. The sticker remained inside my purse resting beside the velvet jewelry box that held the Whitmore bracelet. I remember stopping at a red light near downtown Fairfield and staring at the women crossing the street carrying shopping bags and iced coffees, laughing together beneath the warm spring sunlight. For a brief moment, I wondered what it felt like to move through life without constantly measuring the temperature of every room before entering it. After Richard died, I became very good at reading silence. My house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac lined with maple trees that Richard planted himself nearly 20 years ago. He used to spend entire Saturdays outside trimming branches while Ethan followed him carrying tools that were too heavy for his small arms. Sometimes I still expected to see them through the front window whenever I pulled into the driveway. Father and son, one tall and steady, one eager to become him. But the driveway was empty now except for my sedan and the flower pots beginning to bloom along the porch. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the stillness of the house. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked softly. The scent of lemon furniture polish lingered faintly in the air. Everything looked exactly the same as it had 2 years earlier, yet none of it felt alive anymore. I set my purse on the kitchen counter and carefully removed the sticker again. Leech. Such an ugly word. I thought about the effort it must have taken for someone to print it, peel the backing away, wait for the right moment, and press it onto my dress while pretending to smile at me. Cruelty rarely arrives loudly. Most of the time, it enters quietly disguised as humor. I placed the sticker flat against the marble countertop and stood there staring at it while sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows. Then, against my better judgment, I thought back to the first time Claire came to dinner nearly 7 years earlier. She wore a pale pink sweater and brought homemade cookies she claimed were from her grandmother's recipe. Richard liked her immediately. Ethan looked completely in love. Claire laughed at all the right moments and asked thoughtful questions about our family history. She even offered to help me clear the table afterward. I remember watching her dry dishes beside me while Richard and Ethan talked football in the living room. "You raised a wonderful son," she told me softly. At the time, I believed her kindness was genuine. Maybe part of it was. But over the years, small things began changing one by one. Ethan stopped calling during the week because Claire had scheduled evenings. Holidays became more complicated. I started hearing phrases like, "We already made plans," or "Claire thought it would be easier this way." Even family photos shifted subtly. I noticed I was no longer standing near the center. Then came the strange little humiliations that were always easy to dismiss individually. Claire once moved my purse from a dining chair during Thanksgiving and said, "Oh, I assumed you would rather sit near the kids' table where it is quieter." Another Christmas, she gave all the women matching spa gift cards while handing me a book about healthy aging and memory exercises. Everyone laughed awkwardly. Claire smiled sweetly and claimed she thought I would enjoy it. Ethan never noticed these moments. Or perhaps he noticed and chose comfort over confrontation. That hurt more. Around 6 that evening, my phone buzzed on the counter. Claire's name appeared on the screen beside a photo of her smiling with Ethan at some vineyard last fall. I let it ring twice before answering. "Margaret," she said brightly, "I just wanted to thank you again for coming today. Everyone thought you looked beautiful." I leaned lightly against the counter. "That is kind of you to say. And thank you for the bracelet," she continued quickly. "It is absolutely stunning." I almost cried when I opened it. Her voice sounded polished, practiced. Somewhere behind her I could hear laughter and clinking glasses. The after-party had probably started already. "I am glad you liked it," I replied calmly. There was a short pause before she lowered her voice slightly. "Also, I hope you did not take some of the jokes too seriously today. You know how bridal showers get. People act silly." I glanced down at the sticker resting on my counter. Bright pink against white marble. "Of course," I said softly. "People reveal quite a lot about themselves at parties." Claire laughed nervously. "Exactly." After we hung up, I remained standing there in silence for a long time. Then I opened the drawer beside the refrigerator and removed a small envelope Richard had left me months before he passed away. My name was written across the front in his careful handwriting. I had never opened it. Somehow, I suddenly felt ready. I carried the envelope into the living room and sat down in Richard's old leather chair beside the fireplace. The lamp near the window cast a warm amber glow across the room, while rain tapped softly against the glass outside. Connecticut evenings always felt colder after sunset, especially in homes where someone important was missing. For a few moments, I simply held the envelope in my hands without opening it. Richard's handwriting alone was enough to tighten something painfully inside my chest. He had always written slowly and carefully, as though words mattered too much to rush. Finally, I slid one finger beneath the seal and unfolded the letter inside. "Margaret, If you are reading this, something has changed. That was the first sentence. I felt my throat tighten immediately. Richard had written the letter during the final months of his illness when the doctors had already stopped speaking in hopeful language. He knew time was running out long before Ethan or I were willing to admit it. The paper trembled slightly in my hands as I continued reading. I know you will spend your first years without me trying to keep this family together. That is who you are. But if there ever comes a day when you feel disrespected in your own family, I need you to stop apologizing for existing. I closed my eyes for a moment after reading that line. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. Richard always understood people better than I did. I believed love fixed things if you gave enough of it away. Richard believed character revealed itself eventually, no matter how carefully people hid it. As I kept reading, I noticed several names written farther down the page. Samuel Hayes, Whitmore Holdings, Heritage Trust. My heartbeat slowed strangely. Samuel Hayes had been Richard's attorney and closest friend for more than 30 years. He handled everything from our estate planning to the company investments Richard rarely discussed at home. Near the bottom of the letter, Richard had underlined one sentence twice. If you ever feel unsafe, pressured, or humiliated by anyone in this family, call Samuel immediately before making any decisions. I stared at the words for a long time. Humiliated. Richard had chosen that word specifically. Not angry. Not lonely. Humiliated. Slowly, memories began rearranging themselves in my mind like puzzle pieces finally locking together. About a year before Richard died, Ethan and Claire started asking unusual questions during family dinners. Have you and Dad thought about downsizing? Claire had asked casually one evening while passing the salad dressing. Another time, Ethan mentioned how difficult large homes become for older people living alone. At the time, I assumed they were concerned about me. Looking back now, I realized neither of them had ever actually asked what I wanted. They only discussed what would eventually happen to the house, the investments, and Richard's company shares. The next morning, I woke before sunrise after barely sleeping. The rain had stopped overnight, leaving the backyard silver with morning dew. I stood at the kitchen sink making coffee while staring out toward Richard's garden shed beneath the trees. For years, Ethan used to help his father repaint that little building every spring. They would spend entire weekends outside together while I brought lemonade onto the patio. I missed those versions of them more than I could explain. Around 8:30, my phone buzzed again. Ethan this time. I considered ignoring it, but answered anyway. Morning, Mom, he said distractedly. I could hear traffic in the background. Did Claire thank you again for the bracelet? She is obsessed with it. She called last night. I replied quietly. Good. A short pause followed. Listen, Claire was worried maybe somebody crossed the line yesterday with some dumb joke at the shower. I said nothing. Ethan exhaled awkwardly. You know how people are at those events. Too much champagne. Too many opinions. Did you know about it? I asked calmly. Silence. Not long. Just long enough. No, he answered finally, but his voice lacked conviction. I closed my eyes briefly. Mothers recognize hesitation in their children even when they are grown men wearing expensive watches and driving luxury cars. I see, I said softly. Ethan quickly changed the subject. Anyway, Claire and I are meeting with a realtor this afternoon. There is a property in Westport we really love. 5 bedrooms. Water view. We are thinking about making an offer before the wedding. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug. That sounds expensive. Ethan laughed lightly. Well, once everything settles after the wedding, things are going to look pretty different financially. There it was again. That assumption. That quiet confidence. As though my life had already been converted into numbers waiting to pass into someone else's hands. I hope it works out for you, I replied. After we hung up, I stood motionless in the kitchen for several seconds before finally reaching for my phone again. Then, for the first time since Richard's funeral, I searched for Samuel Hayes' number. Samuel Hayes answered on the second ring with the same calm voice I remembered from years ago. Margaret, he said gently, sounding more surprised than confused. I have been expecting this call for quite some time. I stood near the kitchen window gripping the phone tighter. Richard left me a letter, I told him quietly. I think he wanted me to contact you if certain things started happening. Samuel was silent for a moment. Then he sighed softly. Can you come into the office this afternoon? By 1 o'clock, I was driving toward downtown Stamford beneath gray spring clouds that hung low over the highway. Samuel's office overlooked the harbor from the 23rd floor of a glass building Richard once jokingly called the world's most expensive aquarium. I had not been there since the funeral. The receptionist recognized me immediately and offered coffee while I waited, but my stomach felt too tight for anything except water. Samuel appeared a few minutes later carrying a leather folder beneath one arm. He looked older than I remembered. His hair had gone almost completely silver, and there were deeper lines around his eyes now. Grief ages everyone differently. "You look tired," he said kindly as he led me into his office. "I suppose I am." He closed the door quietly behind us and motioned for me to sit. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the room overlooking the water below, but Samuel did not waste time with small talk. He opened the folder carefully and removed several documents clipped together with colored tabs. "Richard updated his estate structure about 8 months before he passed away," he explained. "Most of it was designed to protect you." I frowned slightly. "Protect me from what?" Samuel looked at me steadily across the desk. "From being pressured out of your own life." The room suddenly felt very quiet. He slid the first document toward me. At the top were the words Whitmore Heritage Trust printed in dark blue letters. Richard transferred a significant portion of his holdings into a protected trust before his death, Samuel continued. The house, investment accounts, several commercial properties, and controlling interest in Whitmore Holdings. I stared down at the paperwork without speaking. "Ethan told me he inherited the company," I said finally. "He inherited operational responsibilities," Samuel corrected calmly. "Not controlling ownership." My eyes lifted slowly toward him. "What does that mean exactly?" Samuel folded his hands together. "It means you remain the majority beneficiary and final approval authority over all major financial decisions connected to the trust." I blinked several times trying to absorb the information. Richard had never discussed any of this with me directly. During his illness, most conversations centered around treatments, family, and pretending we still had more time than we actually did. "Why would Richard keep this from Ethan?" I asked softly. Samuel hesitated before answering. "Because Richard became concerned near the end." "Concerned about Claire?" Another pause. "Concerned about influence." Outside the office windows, a ferry moved slowly across the harbor beneath the cloudy sky. Everything suddenly felt strangely distant, as though I were watching my own life from outside myself. Samuel opened another folder and slid a second document across the desk. "There is also a behavioral clause attached to the trust." I looked down at the page again. Legal language filled nearly every line, but one sentence had been highlighted. "In cases involving coercion, humiliation, elder exploitation, or intentional emotional distress toward Margaret Whitmore, beneficiary access may be suspended pending trustee review." I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. "Richard wrote this himself?" I asked quietly. Samuel nodded. "Your husband loved you very much, Margaret. But he was also observant. He noticed things. Suddenly, memories surfaced faster than I could process them. Claire insisting I should stop driving long distances because it was safer. Ethan suggesting I put his name on certain accounts for convenience. The constant jokes about downsizing, retirement communities, simplifying my life. Samuel reached into the folder again and placed a small photograph on the desk between us. It was taken at a company Christmas party 3 years earlier. Richard stood beside me smiling while Ethan and Claire stood nearby, holding champagne glasses. I looked happy in the picture. "Safe." Samuel tapped the edge of the photo gently. "Richard gave me instructions very specifically," he said. "He told me not to interfere unless you came to me first. He wanted to believe Ethan would eventually grow a spine and protect his mother on his own." My chest tightened painfully at that sentence. Because deep down, I knew Richard had been waiting for something that never happened. Samuel leaned back, slowly in his chair. "Margaret," he said carefully, "has anyone recently made you feel humiliated or pressured?" I thought about the bridal shower, the laughter, the sticker folded neatly inside my purse. Then I remembered Ethan's voice on the phone discussing his future mansion with quiet certainty, as though my life had already been divided and distributed. I reached into my handbag calmly and placed the bright pink sticker onto Samuel's desk without saying a word. For the first time since I arrived, his expression hardened completely. Samuel did not speak for several seconds after seeing the sticker. He simply stared at it lying on the polished walnut desk between us while the muted sounds of traffic drifted faintly through the office windows. Then he removed his glasses slowly and rubbed one hand across his jaw. Richard was afraid of this, he said quietly. I looked down at my hands folded neatly in my lap. I think part of me was too, I admitted. Samuel leaned forward slightly. Margaret, I need to ask you something honestly. Have Ethan and Claire ever pressured you financially? The question settled heavily into the room. At first, I instinctively wanted to defend them. Mothers spend years protecting their children even from the truth. But suddenly I felt too tired to keep rearranging reality into something gentler than it was. Not directly, I said carefully. But there have been conversations. Samuel nodded as though he expected that answer. Tell me. So I did. I told him about Ethan casually suggesting I add him to my checking account after Richard passed away because it would make things easier later. I told him about Claire constantly bringing up retirement communities with less maintenance. I described holidays where conversations somehow always drifted toward inheritance taxes, real estate values, and what young couples could afford once older generations finally simplified their lives. Saying the words aloud made everything sound uglier than I had allowed myself to admit before. Samuel listened quietly without interrupting. When I finished, he opened another folder from the stack beside him. There is something else you should know, he said. He slid a financial statement across the desk toward me. At first, the numbers blurred together. Then I recognized Ethan's name attached to several pending transactions connected to Whitmore Holdings. What is this? I asked. Loan inquiries, Samuel replied calmly. Your son recently began exploring financing options using anticipated future trust distributions as leverage. I looked up sharply, without speaking to me. Apparently, he assumed approval would not be an issue. A strange ache spread slowly through my chest. Not anger exactly. Something colder. The realization that my son had already begun building a future around money that was never truly his. Samuel pointed toward one line near the bottom of the document. There is also a pending real estate purchase tied to this financing structure. Westport, the mansion Ethan mentioned over the phone earlier that morning. 5 bedrooms. Waterview. Claire's dream house. Suddenly, I could picture her walking through enormous empty rooms, choosing paint colors and planning parties, while quietly calculating how long it would take for me to disappear from the equation completely. Can they access any of this without my approval? I asked softly. Samuel's expression remained calm. No. That single word settled over me with surprising weight. No. For the first time in nearly 2 years, I felt something unfamiliar returning slowly beneath the grief and humiliation. Stability. Samuel closed the folders carefully and folded his hands together again. Richard created multiple layers of protection specifically because he feared emotional pressure would eventually be used against you. He explained. Legally speaking, no major financial movement connected to the trust can happen without your direct authorization. I let out a slow breath I had not realized I was holding. Does Ethan know that? Samuel hesitated. Not fully. Outside the windows, sunlight finally began breaking through the gray clouds over the harbor. Thin strips of gold reflected across the water below. Samuel studied me carefully before speaking again. Margaret, I need to be clear about something. You are not powerless here. Not emotionally. Not legally. Not financially. I almost laughed at that because powerless was exactly how I had felt ever since Richard's funeral. Like a guest slowly overstaying her welcome inside her own family. Samuel reached for the pink sticker again and held it briefly between 2 fingers. People who truly love you do not humiliate you publicly for entertainment, he said quietly. And they certainly do not do it while expecting access to your protection afterward. That sentence lingered in my mind long after our meeting ended. By the time I left the office building, the rain clouds had fully cleared. The harbor glittered beneath the afternoon sunlight, while businessmen hurried along the sidewalks carrying briefcases and coffee cups. Life moving normally all around me while mine quietly shifted beneath the surface. As I pulled into my driveway later that evening, I noticed another car parked beside the curb near my mailbox. Claire's white Range Rover. I sat motionless behind the steering wheel for several seconds watching her through the windshield. She stood on my porch wearing oversized sunglasses and scrolling through her phone impatiently, one designer heel tapping lightly against the wooden steps. The moment she saw my car, Her expression brightened instantly into practiced sweetness. But this time, for the first time in years, I noticed how quickly the smile appeared, and how quickly it disappeared the second she thought no one was looking. I stepped out of the car slowly while Claire removed her sunglasses with one smooth motion and smiled, as though we were close friends meeting for lunch, instead of two women standing in the wreckage of something neither of us wanted to name openly. "Margaret," she said brightly as I walked toward the porch. "I hope I am not interrupting your evening." I unlocked the front door calmly. "You are already here." For the briefest moment, something sharp flickered behind her expression before the smile returned again. Claire followed me inside, carrying the expensive white handbag Ethan bought her for Christmas last year. The heels of her shoes clicked softly across the hardwood floors while she glanced around the house with quiet familiarity. I suddenly realized how often she must have imagined this place belonging to her eventually. "Your home always smells so beautiful," she said casually, "like lemon and fresh flowers." "Richard liked things clean," I replied. She removed her coat carefully and draped it over the dining chair before turning toward me with that same polished warmth she used at charity events and engagement parties. "I actually came because I felt terrible about yesterday," she said softly. "I barely slept thinking about how uncomfortable you must have felt." I studied her face without answering immediately. Claire had perfected concern the same way some women perfect makeup tutorials or dinner recipes. "Everything looked convincing until you stared a little too long." "That is thoughtful of you," I said finally. Claire exhaled dramatically and sat at the kitchen island while I poured myself a glass of water. "Honestly, some of my friends can be immature," she continued. "One of the bridesmaids admitted she thought the sticker would be funny. She feels awful now." I leaned lightly against the counter. "Does she?" Claire nodded quickly, completely horrified. I told her it crossed a line. I took a small sip of water without breaking eye contact. And yet no one removed it. Silence. Only for a second. But enough. Claire recovered immediately with a sad little smile. "Margaret, there were over 30 people there. Things happened fast." "Not that fast." Her fingers tightened slightly around the strap of her purse. There it was again. That tiny crack beneath the performance. Claire changed tactics almost instantly. "Ethan feels terrible too," she said gently. "He loves you very much." I almost laughed at the sentence because love without courage eventually becomes indistinguishable from indifference. Instead, I simply set my glass down beside the sink. "How is the house hunting going?" I asked calmly. Claire blinked once, clearly surprised by the shift. Then her smile widened. "Actually, very well. The Westport property is incredible. Water view, private dock, huge, entertaining space." Her eyes brightened now with genuine excitement. "You would absolutely love it." I noticed the confidence in her voice again, the assumption, as though their future had already been secured neatly beneath their feet. "It sounds expensive," I repeated quietly. Claire laughed lightly. "Well, Ethan says everything should work out once the trust distributions become accessible after the wedding." I let the silence sit between us this time. Claire's smile faded almost imperceptibly. "What?" she asked carefully. "Nothing," I replied. "I was just thinking about Richard." Her posture stiffened slightly at his name. "He always wanted Ethan to have a successful future," she said quickly. "I know." I walked slowly toward the hallway table where framed family photographs lined the wall beneath the staircase. One picture showed Ethan at 12 years old standing beside Richard after winning a Little League championship. Another showed our first Christmas after Ethan graduated college. Before Claire. Before all the careful distancing began. Richard believed character mattered more than appearances, I said softly while looking at the photographs. Claire remained silent behind me. "He used to say money only reveals who people already are." I heard her shift slightly on the stool. "Margaret, I hope you do not think Ethan and I care about your money." I turned toward her then. Calmly. "Do you?" For the first time since arriving, Claire looked genuinely uncomfortable. Her mouth opened slightly before closing again. She stood up and smoothed invisible wrinkles from her cream-colored blouse. "I think maybe we are misunderstanding each other," she said carefully. "I would hate for one silly incident to create tension in the family before the wedding." Family. The word sounded strangely fragile now. I walked back toward the kitchen island and opened the small drawer beside the refrigerator. Inside sat the bright pink sticker folded neatly into a perfect square. Without speaking, I placed it gently on the marble countertop between us. Claire stared down at it. The color drained from her face slowly, almost beautifully, like sunlight fading from a room at dusk. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then very quietly, I asked the question she clearly had not expected. Claire, when exactly did you stop seeing me as a person and start seeing me as an obstacle? Claire stared at the folded sticker on the marble countertop as though it might disappear if she waited long enough. The confidence she carried into my house had vanished almost completely now. In its place sat something colder and far more honest. Calculation. Margaret, she said carefully, I think you are taking this much more personally than it was intended. I almost smiled at that because people always say something was not intended after they finally realize consequences exist. Someone placed the word leech on my back at your bridal shower. I replied quietly. Tell me honestly, Claire, what exactly was the intended interpretation? She folded her arms tightly across her chest. It was immature. I already told you that. No, I said calmly. You told me it was a joke. The room fell silent again. Outside, the evening light had started fading across the front lawn, leaving soft shadows against the windows. Claire looked toward the family photographs lining the hallway as though searching for an easier version of this conversation somewhere inside them. You have never liked me, she said finally. I blinked once, genuinely surprised by the shift. That is not true. Really? Her voice sharpened slightly now. Because ever since Ethan and I got engaged, I have constantly felt judged by you. I leaned lightly against the kitchen counter. Judged for what? She laughed once under her breath. For wanting more. For expecting a good life. I studied her face carefully then. For the first time, Claire no longer sounded polished or rehearsed. She sounded defensive. Young. There is nothing wrong with wanting a good life, I said softly. But there is something very wrong with treating other people as disposable on the way there. Her jaw tightened. That is not what this is. Then explain it to me. Claire looked down briefly before speaking again. Do you know how difficult it has been building a future with Ethan while everything in this family still revolves around Richard? The sentence caught me off guard. Richard is dead, I replied quietly. Exactly, she snapped before catching herself. She inhaled slowly and lowered her voice again. What I mean is, even now, everything still belongs to him. The company, the house, the trust. Ethan feels like he has spent his entire life waiting to become his own man. I stared at her for a long moment without speaking, because suddenly I understood something important. Claire did not only resent me. She resented dependency itself. She wanted control, stability, security, and she believed those things had been unfairly delayed by my continued existence inside the Whitmore family structure. So humiliating me made you feel more in control? I asked softly. Claire looked away immediately. There it was, the answer hidden inside the silence. Just then, headlights swept briefly across the front windows as another car pulled into the driveway. Ethan. Claire straightened instantly, smoothing her hair and wiping all visible tension from her face before the front door even opened. Some habits become automatic after enough practice. Ethan walked inside carrying his laptop bag and stopped immediately when he saw us standing in the kitchen. His eyes moved from Claire to me to the folded sticker on the counter. What is going on? He asked cautiously. Claire answered first. Your mother thinks I orchestrated the bridal shower prank. Ethan looked exhausted more than shocked. Mom, I watched him carefully. Even now, he still approached the conversation like a man trying to calm two difficult women instead of confronting what actually happened. Did you know about it? I asked him quietly. Ethan loosened his tie with one hand. No. Did you ask anyone to apologize? He hesitated. Claire already handled it. That is not what I asked. His face hardened slightly then. What exactly do you want me to say? The question settled heavily between us. For years, I probably would have softened immediately to avoid conflict. Mothers are trained to preserve peace even when it costs them dignity. But something inside me had shifted permanently now. I want you to say it was cruel, I answered calmly. Ethan looked toward Claire instinctively before speaking. That tiny movement hurt more than the words themselves. It was a stupid joke, he muttered finally. Not cruelty. I nodded slowly. I see. Claire stepped closer to him immediately, almost relieved by his response. Margaret, nobody was trying to hurt you, she said softly. Then why did someone laugh when they saw it? Neither of them answered. Ethan rubbed one hand across his forehead impatiently. Can we please not turn this into some huge family crisis days before the wedding? Family crisis. I almost repeated the phrase aloud because he still did not understand. The crisis had not started at the bridal shower. It started years ago the moment respect quietly disappeared and nobody cared enough to stop it. I looked at my son standing beside the woman he planned to marry and realized something deeply painful. Ethan no longer saw my humiliation as alarming because he had slowly normalized it over time. And once disrespect becomes normal inside a family, cruelty rarely stays small for very long. The silence inside the kitchen stretched so long that eventually even Ethan looked uncomfortable standing inside it. Claire crossed her arms tightly while avoiding the sticker on the counter, as though refusing to acknowledge it would somehow erase what it represented. I looked at my son carefully then, really looked at him in a way I had been avoiding for years. The tired expression, the expensive watch Richard bought him after business school, the nervous habit of loosening his tie whenever confrontation appeared. He still looked so much like his father physically, but emotionally, something essential had gone missing somewhere along the way. I think it is time for both of you to leave, I said quietly. Ethan blinked. Mom, come on. No, I replied calmly. I am tired, and this conversation is no longer productive. Claire grabbed her purse immediately, clearly relieved by the escape route. But Ethan remained standing near the kitchen island. You are seriously going to let this ruin everything before the wedding? He asked. That sentence settled heavily in my chest, because even now he still believed the problem was my reaction rather than the humiliation itself. I am not ruining anything, I answered. Softly. I am finally paying attention. Ethan exhaled sharply through his nose while Claire moved toward the front door. We should go, she murmured under her breath. Before leaving, she paused briefly beside the hallway table where the framed family photographs stood beneath the staircase. Her eyes lingered on one picture in particular. Richard and me at our 40th anniversary dinner, smiling beside Ethan years before Claire entered our lives. Something unreadable passed across her face before she looked away again. Good night, Margaret, she said politely. I nodded once. Good night, Claire. Ethan hesitated longer. For one small moment, he almost looked like the little boy who used to run into my arms after baseball practice carrying grass stains across his uniform and excitement across his face. But then his phone buzzed in his pocket. The moment disappeared. I will call you tomorrow, he muttered before following Claire outside. I stood alone in the entryway listening to the front door close behind them. Then the engine started. Tires rolled slowly down the driveway. Silence returned again. But this time the silence felt different somehow. Cleaner. Later that night, I carried Richard's letter upstairs and placed it carefully beside my bed before changing into my nightgown. Rain began falling again around midnight, tapping softly against the bedroom windows while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the trees. I could never sleep properly during storms after Richard died. He used to count the seconds between lightning and thunder like a child while I laughed at him from beneath the blankets. Around 1 a.m, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. Olivia. I sat up slowly and answered immediately. Sweetheart. Her small voice sounded hesitant. Grandma, did something happen tonight? I leaned back gently against the headboard. Olivia was 16 now, old enough to notice far more than adults realized. Why do you ask? There was a brief pause. Dad and Claire were fighting in the kitchen after they got home. My chest tightened slightly. I see. Olivia lowered her voice further. Claire kept saying you were overreacting, and Dad kept asking if she knew who put the sticker on you. I closed my eyes briefly. Even now, Ethan wanted to believe this happened around Claire instead of because of her. Grandma. Olivia whispered carefully. Did somebody really call you that? I looked toward the rain streaking softly down the bedroom windows. Yes. Silence filled the line for several seconds. Then Olivia spoke again very quietly. I thought it was mean. Something inside me cracked gently at those words because out of everyone in the family, the youngest person had shown the clearest understanding of what mattered. Thank you, sweetheart, I said softly. Olivia hesitated again before speaking. Grandpa would have been really mad. I smiled faintly despite myself. Yes, I whispered. He would have. After we hung up, I remained awake long after the storm passed. Around 3 a.m, I finally walked downstairs into Richard's old study, carrying only a small lamp for light. The room still smelled faintly like cedarwood and paper. His books remained perfectly arranged on the shelves exactly as he left them. I sat behind his desk and slowly opened the locked drawer Samuel mentioned earlier that afternoon. Inside sat several neatly organized folders tied with dark blue ribbon. Trust documents, company records, personal letters. At the very top rested a sealed envelope with Ethan's name written across the front in Richard's careful handwriting. I stared at it for a long time before finally turning it over. Across the back flap, Richard had written one final sentence. Only give this to our son if he ever forgets what protecting his mother is supposed to mean. The envelope remained on Richard's desk for 3 days before I finally called Ethan and asked him to come over alone. During those 3 days, something strange happened inside me. The fear disappeared, not the sadness. I still missed Richard every time I walked past his empty chair in the living room or heard rain tapping against the windows at night. But the fear of losing my place inside the family had quietly faded because I finally understood something important. You cannot lose a place people already decided to take from you. Ethan arrived just after 6 on Thursday evening, wearing a navy suit and looking exhausted. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes now, and the tension in his face reminded me painfully of Richard during difficult years at the company. "Claire stayed home," he said immediately after stepping inside. I figured that was probably best. I nodded once and led him toward the study. The moment he entered the room, his posture changed slightly. Richard's presence still lingered there somehow. In the bookshelves, the leather chair, the framed photographs from business dinners and family vacations. Ethan glanced around slowly before sitting down across from me at the desk. "Mom," he began carefully, "I know things have been tense lately." "Tense," I repeated softly. "Is that the word you would use?" He looked down briefly. "I know the shower incident upset you." There it was again. Upset. Such a small, harmless word for humiliation. I opened the desk drawer calmly and removed the envelope with his name written across the front. Ethan frowned slightly the moment he recognized his father's handwriting. "What is that?" "Something Richard left behind." I slid the envelope toward him slowly across the desk. "For you." Ethan hesitated before picking it up. The room remained completely silent except for the ticking grandfather clock downstairs while he opened the flap and unfolded the letter inside. I watched his expression carefully as his eyes moved across the page. Confusion first, then surprise, then something far heavier. "What is this?" he whispered finally. "The truth," I answered quietly. Ethan read the letter again, more slowly this time. Richard's words covered nearly 3 pages in careful blue ink. He wrote about responsibility, character, family. But one paragraph clearly struck hardest because Ethan stopped breathing normally after reaching it. "Son, if you are reading this because your mother handed you this envelope herself, then somewhere along the way you failed to protect the person who protected you your entire life." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. I looked away toward the rain beginning outside the windows again. Connecticut storms always arrived suddenly this time of year. "Dad wrote this before he died?" he asked hoarsely. 8 months before." Ethan swallowed hard while continuing to read. Richard explained the trust structure in detail. The protections, the ownership rights, the behavioral clause connected to emotional mistreatment and public humiliation. Every assumption Ethan built his future around unraveled quietly line by line inside that room. "Claire does not know any of this," he muttered eventually. "No," he stared down at the paperwork again. "The Westport house cannot move forward without trustee approval." Ethan rubbed one hand across his mouth slowly. "Jesus." I remained calm. "Your father loved you very much." Ethan laughed bitterly under his breath. "Then why would he set this up?" I looked at my son carefully before answering. "Because he understood people better than either of us wanted to admit." Silence settled over the room again. Then Ethan asked the question I think frightened him most. "Do you think Claire planned that?" I held his gaze steadily. "I think your fiancé allowed me to be humiliated publicly and expected me to tolerate it quietly because everyone assumed I still needed their approval." Ethan leaned back heavily in the chair. For the first time since Richard died, he looked genuinely ashamed instead of defensive. "I should have said something," he whispered. The sadness in his voice almost broke my heart because underneath the expensive suit and adult failures, I could still hear traces of the little boy who once cried after accidentally stepping on one of my garden flowers. "Yes," I said softly. "You should have." Ethan lowered his head into his hands for several seconds before speaking again. "Claire said it was harmless. She said you were overreacting. And what do you think now?" He looked up slowly, Eyes red around the edges though no tears fell. I think I stopped noticing things I should have noticed a long time ago. Outside, thunder rolled low across the dark sky, while rain streaked softly down the study windows. Ethan looked around the room again at the photographs, the bookshelves, Richard's old desk. The entire life his father spent building. Then he looked back at me differently than he had in years. Not like an obstacle, not like a burden, like his mother. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. I folded my hands together atop the desk and thought carefully before answering, because for the first time in a very long while, the next chapter of this family no longer belonged entirely to other people. "That," I said softly, "depends on whether your future is built on love or entitlement."